The stone walls were supposed to protect them. 40 feet high, 10 feet thick, built to keep the world out and the holy in. But on that freezing January morning in 1619, when the Mother Superior burst through the heavy oak doors of the chapel, her face drained of all color, everyone knew the impossible had happened. Again, the thing they whispered about in shadows, the thing that wasn't supposed to exist behind these consecrated walls, had clawed its way into the light. And this time, the woman at the center of the storm wore a crown before she wore a veil. Picture this. Your nobility, maybe even royalty. Your entire life's been mapped out since before you could walk. But here's the kicker, you're not the eldest son. You're not even a son. You're a daughter, and in medieval Europe, that means you've got exactly 3 options: marriage, motherhood, or the convent. And if your family decides that convents are cheaper than dowries, well, congratulations. Your fate's sealed. They'll dress it up real nice, tell everyone how pious you are, how you've been called by God. But everybody knows the truth. You're being warehoused, stored away where you can't embarrass anyone, can't claim inheritance, can't complicate the family tree. These weren't just any women we're talking about. These were princesses, noblewomen, daughters of emperors and kings. Women who grew up in palaces, who were educated, who understood power because they watched it being wielded every single day of their lives. And then, overnight, they're locked behind walls with a bunch of other unwilling prisoners wearing the same black habits, expected to pray away the next 40 or 50 years. Now, the church had rules. Oh boy, did they have rules. Strict enclosure, they called it. No men allowed inside except priests for confession and mass. No women allowed outside except in cases of absolute emergency. The walls weren't just physical, they were supposed to be spiritual barriers between the sacred feminine and the corrupting masculine world. The entire system was built on one foundational assumption: that separation equals purity. Keep the women locked away from men and everything stays holy, everything stays clean, everything stays under control. But here's what those medieval architects of morality didn't count on. Human nature doesn't give a damn about your walls. Let's roll back to the year 1619, to a convent in Pescia, a small town in Tuscany where the cypress trees stand like dark sentinels, and the summer heat makes the stones sweat. The Convent of the Mother of God, that's what they called it. Sounds peaceful, right? It wasn't. Behind those walls lived a woman who would become one of the most controversial figures in Catholic history. Her name was Benedetta Carlini, and her story is so wild, so absolutely bonkers, that when the Vatican archives finally cracked open centuries later, historians literally couldn't believe what they were reading. Benedetta wasn't just any nun. She came from money, from influence. Her parents had connections, which meant she got to be abbess, basically the CEO of the convent. But Benedetta started having visions. And not your garden variety "I saw Mary in my soup" kind of visions. We're talking full-blown mystical experiences. Stigmata appearing on her hands, divine possessions, speaking in tongues, the whole 9 yards, and people believed her. Important people. Cardinals sent investigators. The local community started treating her like a living saint. But here's where it gets complicated. There was another nun in that convent, a younger woman named Bartolomea. And according to the Inquisition records, and yeah, this got serious enough that the Inquisition got involved, Benedetta and Bartolomea had a relationship. An intimate relationship. For years. Bartolomea eventually testified that Benedetta would claim to be possessed by a male angel named Splendidolo. And during these possessions, well, the relationship became physical. Now, when whispers started leaking out about a possible pregnancy, all hell broke loose. The investigation intensified. Was Benedetta actually pregnant? The historical record gets murky here, conveniently murky. The way records always get murky when powerful institutions need them to. But the scandal was enough. The mystic who had been on her way to sainthood ended up spending the last 30 years of her life in solitary confinement within the convent walls. Same building, different cage. Let's shift gears. Spain, 13th century. If you think the Italian convents were dramatic, you haven't heard about the Iberian Peninsula, where royal blood mixed with religious fervor created a cocktail of absolute chaos. There's this persistent historical mystery surrounding several royal women who got shuttled into convents under questionable circumstances. And one name keeps popping up in the scandalous margins of medieval chronicles. The daughter of a Castilian king. Historians argue about which king, because conveniently, records from this era are either missing or heavily redacted, was placed in a convent after a political marriage fell through. The official story: she had a religious calling. The actual story, according to contemporary chronicles that survived in monastery libraries: she was inconvenient. The political landscape had shifted, and her marriage would have created the wrong alliances. So into the convent she went. But here's the thing about these royal convents: they weren't isolated fortresses in the wilderness. They were often right in the middle of cities, with confessor priests coming and going, male servants handling heavy labor, and various ecclesiastical officials conducting inspections. The walls were meant to separate, but human beings are really good at finding ways around walls when they want to. This particular princess, according to a chronicle written by a monk 50 years after the events, became close with her confessor. Too close. The kind of close that resulted in a very visible problem. When the pregnancy could no longer be hidden, the scandal threatened to explode beyond the convent walls and splash all over the royal family. The solution: creative record-keeping. The princess was suddenly reported to be gravely ill with a mysterious swelling condition. She was moved to a remote section of the convent, and then, just as suddenly, she recovered. The child, if it existed, vanished from all official records. Some historians believe the baby was quietly given to a peasant family. Others think darker outcomes were involved. The confessor, transferred to a monastery 300 miles away. The princess spent the rest of her life in that convent, never mentioned in court documents again, erased from the family narrative like she'd never existed. Now let's talk about Germany, because the German territories had their own brand of convent scandal, and this one involves actual documented evidence that survived the centuries. The Quedlinburg Abbey wasn't just any religious house. This was a prestigious imperial abbey where the abbesses were effectively ruling princesses. They governed territories, collected taxes, commanded armies. These women had power, real temporal power, not just spiritual authority. In the early 14th century, one of these powerful abbesses, a woman from a noble family with connections to the Holy Roman Emperor, found herself in an impossible situation. The details come from legal documents because this scandal went to court. An imperial court. A knight who had been appointed as a military protector of the abbey's lands became a frequent visitor to the abbey itself. The relationship between the abbess and this knight was apparently common knowledge among the other nuns, whispered about but not openly challenged because, well, who's going to challenge a woman with that much power? Until she got pregnant. The legal documents are fascinating because they show the absolute gymnastics everyone went through to avoid calling it what it was. The abbess claimed divine intervention. Her supporters suggested miraculous conception. Her enemies called it witchcraft and demonic seduction. The knight conveniently died before any charges could be brought against him, suspicious timing that medieval chroniclers definitely noticed and commented on. The resolution: a massive cover-up involving bishops, imperial officials, and half the nobility of the region. The abbess gave birth in secret. The child was sent away, and after a hefty donation to the church and some political maneuvering, the matter was declared closed. The abbess remained in her position for another 15 years. Power, it turns out, can buy a whole lot of forgiveness. But perhaps the most intellectually complex of these scandals involves a woman whose name you might actually recognize, even if you don't realize it: Helice d'Argenteuil. Now, the popular story of Helois and Abelard is this romantic tragedy. Brilliant philosopher falls in love with his brilliant student. They have a secret affair. Angry relatives castrate him. Tragic separation. Endless love letters. Very Romeo and Juliet, except with more Latin and theological debate. But here's what often gets glossed over in the romantic retellings. Helois was sent to a convent after the scandal broke. Not because she wanted to go. She explicitly states in her own letters that she had no religious calling whatsoever. She was forced there as punishment, as a way to disappear a problem. And she was pregnant when she arrived. Their son, astrolabe, yes, they literally named their kid after a medieval astronomical instrument, was born and immediately taken away to be raised by Abelard's family. Helois spent decades in that convent, eventually becoming abbess herself, not through divine calling but through sheer intellectual brilliance and force of personality. Her letters to Abelard, which survived and are studied to this day, are brutally honest about her lack of faith, her resentment at being forced into religious life, and her continuing passion for a man she was forbidden to see. She basically said, out loud in writing that anyone could read, that she'd rather be Abelard's mistress than queen of the world. For a medieval abbess to write that, that's rebellion in ink. The fifth case takes us into even darker territory, to the intersection of medieval medicine, religious superstition, and gender politics. Agnes of Poitou, connected to one of the most powerful families in medieval Europe, entered a convent after being widowed young. The historical records around Agnes are fragmented, pieced together from monastic chronicles, medical treatises, and church investigation documents. Agnes became pregnant while in the convent. Undisputed fact. The question was how? In an era when medicine was barely distinguishable from magic, and when female sexuality was both feared and fundamentally misunderstood, the explanations people came up with tell you everything about medieval mindset. The official investigation conducted by church authorities concluded that Agnes had been visited by an incubus, a male demon that seduces sleeping women. Now, to our modern ears, that sounds absolutely ridiculous. A demon did it. Come on. But here's the thing, this wasn't just medieval superstition. This was a legal and theological framework that served a very specific purpose. If a nun got pregnant and claimed demonic visitation, it meant she wasn't technically guilty of breaking her vows. She was a victim of supernatural assault. It was a loophole, see? A way to preserve the institution's reputation while acknowledging the undeniable physical reality of the pregnancy. But read between the lines of those investigation documents, and you'll find hints of a more mundane truth. References to a priest who visited the convent frequently. Testimony from other nuns about seeing this priest in areas of the convent where he shouldn't have been. And then, suddenly, that priest is transferred to a remote parish, and the investigation quickly wraps up with the incubus conclusion. Agnes gave birth. The child was recorded as born of demonic union and was placed with a family outside the convent. Agnes remained a nun, technically blameless in the eyes of the church, but everybody knew. The other nuns knew. The local community knew. The incubus story was a fig leaf barely covering the obvious truth. So what do all these stories tell us? What's the common thread running through these scandals across centuries and countries? It's this. You can't legislate away human nature. You can build walls 40 feet high. You can write rules in Latin and stamp them with papal seals. You can threaten excommunication and eternal damnation. But you can't fundamentally change the fact that humans are social, emotional, sexual beings who will find connection even in the most restrictive circumstances. These women, princesses, noblewomen, daughters of power, they weren't villains. They were prisoners of a system that gave them no choice, no agency, no voice in their own destinies. They were told their bodies belonged to God, their futures belonged to the church, and their desires didn't exist. And when reality inevitably collided with that fiction, the institutional response was always the same. Deny, cover up, blame the woman, protect the institution. The really fascinating part: these are just the scandals we know about. These are the ones that were dramatic enough, public enough, or involved people important enough that the records survived. How many other pregnancies happened behind those convent walls? How many were successfully hidden? How many children were born in secret, given away, or worse? How many nuns lived and died with secrets that never made it into any chronicle or investigation document? Medieval convents were supposed to be places of spiritual refuge, communities of holy women separated from the corrupting influence of the secular world. But they were also dumping grounds for inconvenient women, pressure cookers of repressed humanity, and stages for power struggles between families, between church factions, between individuals trapped in impossible situations. And here's maybe the most important thing: these women found ways to survive. Benedetta maintained her dignity even in solitary confinement. Helles became one of the most respected intellectuals of her age despite being forced into a life she never wanted. The abbess of Quedlinburg continued to rule her territory with intelligence and strength. They adapted, they endured, they found ways to carve out spaces for themselves, even within the most restrictive systems imaginable. Their stories aren't really about scandal, not at the core. They're about the eternal human struggle between institutional control and individual autonomy. They're about what happens when power structures try to deny fundamental aspects of human experience. They're about resilience in the face of impossible circumstances. These 5 cases spread across centuries and countries, involving women from different backgrounds with different stories. They all ended up in roughly the same place. Not because these women were uniquely sinful or rebellious, but because they were human beings forced into an inhuman system. A system that demanded they stop being fully human the moment they walked through those convent gates. The medieval church eventually had to reckon with these realities. Reforms were implemented. Stricter controls, yes, but also more realistic acknowledgement that strict enclosure wasn't working the way it was supposed to. The Counter-Reformation brought waves of change to convent life, some positive, some just doubling down on control. But the fundamental tension never really resolved. Even today, religious communities around the world still grapple with these questions. How do you balance spiritual ideals with human reality? How do you create space for genuine religious calling, while acknowledging that not everyone behind those walls chose to be there? How do you prevent abuse of power in closed institutional settings? These medieval scandals, shocking as they were to contemporary audiences, they're not just historical curiosities. They're case studies in institutional dysfunction, in the consequences of denying human nature, in what happens when power imbalances meet lack of oversight meet cultures of secrecy. So yeah, 5 royal nuns, 5 pregnancies, 5 scandals that rocked medieval Europe. But more than that, 5 women whose stories survived despite every effort to erase them. 5 testimonies to human resilience. 5 reminders that no wall is ever high enough to completely contain the complexity of human experience. The stones of those convents still stand in many cases. You can visit them, walk through those courtyards, see those thick walls. They're tourist attractions now, heritage sites, beautifully preserved pieces of medieval architecture. But if those walls could talk, if those stones could testify to everything they witnessed across the centuries, the stories they'd tell would be far stranger, far more human, and far more compelling than any official history ever recorded. Because history isn't just what made it into the official records. History is also what people tried desperately to hide, to cover up, to erase. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we dig deep enough into those archives and read between the lines of those careful, sanitized reports, we catch glimpses of the real, messy, complicated human truth underneath. These 5 women lived that truth. And now, centuries later, we're still trying to understand what their stories tell us about power, about choice, about what it means to be human in systems designed to deny your humanity. Pretty wild when you think about it. 5 pregnancies behind sacred walls. 5 scandals that shouldn't have been possible. 5 women who refused to disappear completely, no matter how hard the world tried to erase them.